This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hello and welcome to Daughterhood, the podcast. I am your host, Roseanne Corcoran, Daughterhood Circle Leader and Primary Caregiver. Daughterhood is the creation of Ann Tumlinson, who has worked on the front lines in the healthcare field for many years and has seen the multitude of challenges caregivers face. Our mission is to support and build confidence in women who are managing their parents' care. Daughterhood is what happens when we put our lives on hold to take care of our parents. We recognize this care is too much for one person to handle alone. We want to help you see your efforts are not only good enough, they are actually heroic. Our podcast goal is to bring you some insight into navigating the healthcare system, provide resources for you as a caregiver as well as for you as a person, and help you know that you don't have to endure this on your own. Join me in Daughterhood. While we hear the phrase end-of-life care, what actually occurs in both behavior and bodily changes during the months, weeks, and days prior to death is not something that's usually discussed. This leaves caregivers stressed and wondering what is changing and what they are witnessing. Today, my guest is Barbara Karnes, an award-winning nurse and end-of-life educator. Barbara has put her 40 years of experience regarding education, care, and support of dying people and their loved ones into numerous books and resources. One book in particular, Gone From My Sight, The Dying Experience, published in 1985, has sold over 35 million copies worldwide. Known in the hospice world as the Little Blue Book, it is the most beloved and widely used resource of its kind. Today, we discuss how to prepare ourselves and our care partners, including how to choose the right hospice, what happens with food and other physical and emotional issues at end of life, and how we can be prepared and present as caregivers for those final moments. I hope you enjoy our conversation. As caregivers, we hear and fear the discussion about end-of-life care, but then you're at that point and it's disorienting and confusing and sometimes scary. Barbara, how do caregivers switch gears from regular caregiving for their care partner into caring for them at the end of their life?
I don't think they really realize that they're shifting gears. In fact, I really think at that point where the special person has crossed over into the dying process, that we caregivers really recognize that moment. We're so geared toward helping that we don't realize there's a point where our help needs to change in a different direction. So until, I need to say that months before death, 2 to 4 months before death, a person will actually begin entering the dying process. And the caregiver, they're not really going to catch that. And what occurs is eating habits change, decrease, sleeping habits increase, and socialization. They start withdrawing and not being as interested. With the food, the caregiver, we associate food with love, with so many things.
Yes.
That seems to be the biggest hurdle, It's like, yeah, I can understand he's going to take an afternoon nap and that he sleeps in front of the TV. I understand that. And well, he just doesn't feel like talking to the neighbors. I can understand that, but not eating. No, nope, you got to eat to live. And the caregiver is concentrating on keeping their special person alive. And that means food. The special person is letting go. They're in the dying process. Unconsciously, their body is doing this. If you said to them, have you entered the dying process? They would say, no, 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 I'm fine. But there's that blending. So it's not a specific line that a person crosses that says, okay, now I do this care.
Right.
Until someone says to the caregiver, Dad's entered the dying process. He's now dying, and here's what's going to happen. And here's what you do.
And that would be the hospice, whoever's on board with hospice would say that.
Well, I would hope that a physician would say that.
Yes.
I would hope that the hospital staff, the nursing facility staff would say that. And with saying that, that would then lead to an end-of-life doula or a hospice referral.
It's hard sometimes because doctors don't like to say those things. They like to say, we can keep going, we can keep trying, but they kind of get up to that line, but then they back up from that line. And you're left with that vague, I don't know what's happening.
Oh, absolutely. What we have to remember is that our medical model is about fixing people. It's about fixing the disease that people have. The emphasis there is the word is disease that people have. End of life care is comfort care, is about treating and helping the person that happens to have a disease. It's a big difference there. And I would like to see the medical model put more emphasis on the patient rather than the disease. But I don't know that that's going to happen.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
Yes.
Wouldn't that be great? I agree with you. And it's hard because, again, that falls on the caregiver and it falls in the caregiver's lap. And then even if the caregiver feels that way, like, okay, this is what's going on, there may be other people around that are blowing that off. Like, oh, no, it's fine and they're okay. And look, they were talking to me yesterday. Everything is fine. And it's hard to differentiate that and get other people on board.
Very much so. And it isolates the caregiver. And that isolation leads to doubt, questions of doubt. Am I really, seeing what I'm seeing? Everyone else says he's fine. I'm not sure he is. So that doubt adds more pressure onto the caregiver.
And leads to more guilt.
Oh, guilt. Caregiver carries guilt. I want to take care of my special person, but there are days that I'm so mad at her. Because she won't do what I tell her to do. And I'm the caregiver. I know what she needs, and that's to eat. And so as soon as that anger arises, it's like, oh my goodness, I must be an awful person. I'm mad at mom and she's gonna die. What a horrible person I am. So there's a lot of guilt and frustration and anger that I'm not going to tell anyone. I don't want anyone to know how I'm feeling because I'm not a nice person. So I'm going to keep my mask on. And that brings even more isolation.
Yeah, it's a horrible cycle. When it comes to the feeding, and I'm Italian, so food is the basis of everything.
Mhm.
So When people say, well, we could put a feeding tube in, what is that at end of life? What does a feeding tube, is it a detriment? What is it?
I personally feel it causes more harm than good. And what we have to look at is when the person can't be fixed, when they have entered the dying process, their body automatically will cut back and stop eating. Naturally, normally, the person will get to a place where they're not taking in enough calories for maintenance. What you have to think of is all the organs in the body are shutting down. And yes, food is what keeps us alive, but the disease eats before we do, before the body does. And by putting in the feeding tube, and I have to stress, once the person has entered the dying process, that's when you can look at feeding tube and go, I don't think so, because you'll end up with more complications than you have benefit, more discomfort for the patient because you've got a hole in their stomach with dressings that have to be changed and routine changed. So you're doing a disservice if the person has entered the dying process. That's your operative words.
And that could be 2 to 3 months before they actually pass.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And again, it comes back to communication. You have to have that ability to have a communication and have those conversations, but also hear what's being said or what's not being said from the doctors.
Well, and this is where an advance directive is so important. This is where talking to your family when you're healthy and saying, you know what, when I get to this place, I don't want a feeding tube. I want you to keep me comfortable and love me until I'm gone. But let's not try to keep my body alive if I can't really live in that body. You got to tell your family up front, really before you need to, because that's when they'll be able to hear you. If you do it as you enter the dying process, and there's times that you're very clear in the months before death, then family can go, oh yeah, he's sick and he doesn't really mean it. He doesn't feel good today, so he doesn't really mean it. You need to have the talk before you need to have the talk.
Well, speaking of hard conversations, when your care partner is in the dying stage, people have questions of, do I have to talk about it with them? Do I have to tell them they're dying? What if they don't want to talk about it? What if you don't want to talk about it? Like, does that have to happen?
No, it doesn't have to happen. You're going to let the patient, let your person guide you. They know. They live inside their body. They know. And they're going to face this challenge in the same way that they have addressed any challenge in their life. So you'll have people that will face this with anger. You'll have people face it with denial. You'll have people face it with charge ahead no matter what. Look at their personality, and that will tell you really if you can have a conversation about it. Is if you would be able to talk to Dad about anything as you were growing up and in your relationship, then yeah, you can say, Dad, this isn't looking good. And, you're not going to be here very long. And can we talk about it? That if that's your relationship. But if it isn't your relationship, you don't have to. They know. They live inside of their body. They know whether anyone or doctors or family talk about it or not. You don't necessarily know how it's going to happen, because we don't have any role models. And that makes it really scary. And so fear is on not just the patient, but everyone's part is going to be there. It's a matter of how much that fear is going to be there.
What do you do with that, with the fear? If if you do say something and they're scared, what do you do with that fear?
You say, yeah, this is scary. And we're going to, I'm going to be here and I'm going to support you. I'm scared. I understand you're scared. And we're going to live through this together. We're going to live with this together. Just presence, and I don't mean with a ribbon, and talking if they want to talk. But presence being there says more than really any words that you can say. And there will come a point in the dying process, in the weeks before death, where generally words don't mean anything. They're so withdrawn. It's sit by the bed and hold their hand, rub their back, sit and read to them, whatever, play the music they like, just be there.
How, as a caregiver, do we try to remain present? Because it's hard. Barbara, sometimes it feels like you're not even in your body. You're not in your body. You're not in the room. You've gone somewhere else because it's painful and because it's stressful. So how can we try to do that in these moments?
I would hope that as a caregiver, you have support, that you have someone that you can call up on the phone and say, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what just happened, or I am so scared, or I am so angry. You need a sounding board as a caregiver, and we don't always have one. So if you don't have one, then go in the other room and pretend you have one and talk to yourself or out loud or write. But you need some outlet to get the feelings out so that you can go back in and be a presence, a loving, supportive presence. But recognize these frustrations and anger and scared, all of those feelings are normal, but everyone needs a buddy. Everyone needs someone, a friend that they can call and not be judged, but just say what they need to say and get it out. Because if you carry it in and you don't get it out, then that is going to affect the relationship you have, because there'll be resentment, there'll be anger, there'll be frustration, and you'll direct it as much as you don't want to, but just it'll come out. So let it come out with someone who isn't your special person.
I love that, because it does. It has to come out some way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
In your book, The 11th Hour, you mentioned someone has to be the front runner. There has to be somebody who delivers, who coordinates with everybody. How do you pick that if there's a limited amount of people, or if you're the only person? I mean, obviously, if you're the only person, you're the front runner. But how does that happen within a family unit?
I think every family has their front runner.
Yeah.
Every family has their take charge dominant person. And that's just part of family dynamics. So that person's going to do it. And yet, with those family dynamics, that can create resentment and frustration. And she always is the boss. And, all of that we grew up with as siblings, as family. And yet that's who probably will step in and be the orchestrator, even if that person isn't the primary caregiver. There can be the daughter or the son that lives in a different place, even, who tries to direct and doesn't have a clue of what they're directing or what they're dealing with. And that just adds another challenge to this whole dynamic of end of life.
It's, gosh, it's the same. It's the same when it comes to caregiving with siblings and all of that. It's all just a big stew of emotions and attitudes and opinions. And it doesn't help at this point at end of life care because everybody has a certain expectation to how things should be and how they want things to be. And sometimes it just doesn't happen that way. One of those things, and it's almost a lightning rod for hospice, is morphine.
Mhm.
You speak of it wonderfully, and I'm wondering if you could discuss a little bit of how that is part of this process and how it's not so much that the morphine, quote, killed the person, it is the disease process.
We are so afraid, rightly so, of narcotics, particularly in our society today, that the word morphine creates fear, just the word itself. So, dying itself is not painful. Disease causes pain. So, look at the person's disease history. And if they have a history of pain in their disease, and there's a lot of diseases that cause pain, then you are going to give their pain medicine until their last breath. And you may have to increase that pain medicine as death gets closer because their body is shutting down and nothing works right. So if they're taking liquid morphine, it's going to take longer for it to get throughout the body than if they are months from death rather than being in labor. So there are a lot of diseases that don't cause pain. And if the disease history has no pain in it, then just because they're dying doesn't mean now they have pain and need a narcotic. What the person's body feels like who doesn't have a history of pain in the days to hours before death, their body feels heavy. It feels tired. It's an ache all over feeling that you have if you have the flu, and I don't mean COVID. That ache all over, you wouldn't take a narcotic for that. You might take a 2 or 3 ibuprofen for that. And so if there's restlessness and agitation to the point that you're worrying about them falling out of bed or hurting themselves, then Ativan or Haldol is very appropriate. Now, all that said, a little bit, and I mean a little bit, of morphine will help someone who's in breathing distress. It slows down the breathing and brings a little more comfort. So that's very appropriate, even if a person does not have a disease history of pain. Operative words, a little bit. And add to that, in approaching death, in the days to hours, I keep saying the body's shutting down. So it's not processing anything you put in it. So there is going to be distress. There is going to be breathing distress as part of the natural way we die.
That's it's a lot, and there usually isn't just, and I don't mean to be generalizing here, but usually there's a few things that are happening with someone at the time of death. If they're older, they may have congestive heart failure, and they may have cancer, and they may have something like there could be a bunch of things. So you're really not sure if they're in pain or not, if they're nonverbal, or when you're looking at them and you know what their appearance is normally, and then you see either a grimace or they just don't seem comfortable. Those are the types of instances where you can provide some sort of medication for them. Is that accurate?
Yes. And that restlessness, agitation is probably going to begin weeks before death in what I call labor, and labor's 1 to 3 weeks before death. And part of that is restlessness. an agitation, a picking of the hands of the air, of just not being able to get settled. I don't know that that's actual pain. That's just part of what the body's doing as labor begins. So you have to be aware and watch, is there, if I move him and turn him, does he wince? Does he, even if he doesn't speak, does he look like that hurts? So there is definitely a place for narcotics at end of life. For me, the biggest feature of narcotics at the end of life is education. If whoever's taking care of the caregiver, of the family and the patient, which would be hospice or an end-of-life doula, whoever's doing that, their 90% of their work is education. If you educate the family, because we don't have any role models on what it's like to die,
Right.
if we educate the family as to what dad is doing, and he's doing, this is how you die, and dad's doing a good job, this is what he's supposed to be doing, then we're not going to have, after dad died, someone writing me a letter and saying, hospice killed my mom, hospice killed my dad. It's taking the time to educate, to sit down in the living room and say, and explain how people die. And this is what we're doing to keep them comfortable while they are in the labor of dying. I use the example of in the days to hours before death, the person who's dying is like the little chick that's working to get out of its shell. It's working very, very hard. And we see this and we think something must be wrong. Something's bad's happening. Also, we equate it to labor. We go through labor to get into this world. Some of us have easier labors than others. And we go through labor to leave this world and be birthed into the other world. And some of us can do it easier than others.
I love that. It's hard because I wish we could put you in everybody's house that has hospice, because the education piece is missing. And I can't, again, I don't want to generalize. I know that there are people that have wonderful hospice interactions, and there are people that don't, for whatever reason, for location, for during COVID, it was horrible because people couldn't get their services. And because of that, you're left with this nagging. Was it enough? Was this correct? Did we do everything we could have done? Because again, as a caregiver, you're in charge of everything. And you're in charge at the end of life, even though you don't have the education, and things can happen quickly, or even if they happen slowly, it's happening, and it's almost like disbelief that it's happening. So you're trying to be present in those moments and make the right decision. But if you don't have that education, it only adds to the woulda, coulda, shouldas after the fact.
Absolutely. And that what you just described is why I wrote all that I've written. And I will say, my husband was sick for 2 years before he died just recently. And in the beginning of those 2 years, I wrote a book, By Your Side. It's a guide for the caregiver, because I was in the role of the caregiver. And so I wrote what I wanted caregivers to know from what I learned being that caregiver, because education, as you said, that's the key. Otherwise, we're going to make it up as we go along, and we probably don't know what we're doing as we make it up. We're doing our best, but our best doesn't mean that it's the right thing or a helpful thing.
And it's hard too, because of what happens and because of the process. It's hard to know if that's the right thing. And it's also hard because when you do have hospice and it's almost like, oh, well, it's getting late. Are they off the clock? Are we going to switch? Is the next person that comes in, are they going to understand what's going on? Like there's that business component almost of, okay, well, are you advising this because we've been here for so long?
What brings to mind is hospice is a business, and there are businesses that are good and there are businesses that are lacking. And if you were going to buy a new car, you would test drive it, you would shop the different car dealers in order to make your purchase in how you would feel comfortable with and from a knowledge base. A lot of people do not shop hospice, and I advocate you need to interview before you need them. When you've got your special person is the doctors have said we can't fix you, and even if they're still receiving treatment, there's going to come a day when they won't be fixed. So once you've been told, I can't fix you, go home, put your affairs in order, start shopping hospices. Call them on the phone and have your list of questions, what you want to ask them. And then as you narrow that list down, because depending upon where you live, if you're real rural, you may not have a choice. But most places, there's more than one hospice. Interview them. After you narrow it down, do a face-to-face and then select. If you select one and you're not happy with them, if you feel your needs aren't being met, find another one and go to the one you've got and say, hey, you're not cutting it. You're not giving me what I need. And so I'm going to switch hospices. We have power. It's just that most of us don't know we have choices.
It's so hard. And I can, I mean, I didn't have the best experience with a hospice. And when I tried to switch, I called the doctor's office and asked them for hospice referrals. And they gave me the one I was with. And I said, that's great. Do you have any others? And they were like, oh, wow, they're the best. And I was like, okay, that's great. Do you have any others? Because I'm not really thrilled with this. So I called a couple of the other hospices. And when they asked the hospice that I was with, when I told them, they said, oh, they're great. I don't know why you would want to switch. Swear to you, Barbara, I'm sitting on the phone thinking, this is like a bad dream. And I remember hanging up the phone and saying to my husband, I can't even believe that this is where we're at, that I'm not happy with this. And everybody else is almost like they put their hands up like, oh no, well, you're with the best. So you're fine. It was very weird.
That's very weird. I'm surprised that the competing hospices, and as I'm thinking about this, we as a country, actually, in almost every area, are short-staffed.
Yes.
And so it's easier to not take on another, I'm going to put this in quotes, problem, because the message you're giving is, I'm aware and I'm courageous enough to speak up when I'm not satisfied. And that's really intimidating and scary. And it's easy. And I'm short-staffed to start with. We don't need this.
Yep.
I think that element is there.
I fully agree with you. And it was 2021. It was early 2021. We were still fully in the pandemic mode. And I knew it. But hearing it was shocking.
It's horrible business practice. But I think I know why they did it. Not that why they did it is correct.
Nope. I get it. And I fully agree with you. And I see it. And it was sad. It was really sad. And it made me feel even more isolated because of that. It was like, wow, I can't even get somebody else to come in here. So it's very interesting. And it is, like you said, if I was buying a car, I could get a drive-through. I could, somebody with a video camera is going to drive that car for me. But when it comes to picking a hospice for the most important thing, we don't have that information. And do you have, what's the top 3 questions you would ask a hospice when you call them?
I would ask if they have primary care nursing. That means, do you have the same nurse every time? How can you learn to trust and feel secure in a situation where you have a different nurse every visit? Big part of hospice comfort care is providing a sense of security and I'm not alone feeling. And you have to bond with someone. And it's kind of like baby duck bonding. We need someone to bond with. So that's one question I would ask for. Mm-hmm. I would ask the same of the home health aide who is doing the bathing. You want the same one. So you really want the same team. And then you ask, how often will you be visiting? In the months before death, once a week, in my opinion. And if a person is on hospice, they should not be seen less, no matter what, than once a week. As labor begins, you want to look at 2 to 3 times a week. And then what would be ideal and is not happening anywhere really is you really would like someone to be with you in the hours before death. And today, often you call and they say, let me know when he's dead and we'll do a pronouncement call. And that's not my idea of support and guidance. So ask, do you do a death call or do you just do a pronouncement call? Will you be coming every day as death gets very, very close? Those, I think, are really important questions. And I'm sorry to say, they may not be answered satisfactorily.
Right. And the difference between a death call and a pronouncement call is?
A death call, in my mind, is and I should call it an approaching death, in the hours before death, when ideally, the family have been educated and have gone from my site in the 11th hour and can look and go, oh, yeah, Dad's doing this.
Right.
In those hours, you call hospice and you say, Dad's doing this. And the hospice nurse says, I'll be right over. Right. Whether it's 3 a.m. or whether it's 3 p.m. And stays until death comes. Now, there are times when labor goes on and on and on, and you have to say, he could die in 15 minutes and he could die in 15 hours, and I've got to go home. But you can call. We've talked about what to look for, what's going to happen. So there is that element. But I would love, okay, let me say this. The moment of death is the goal of all end-of-life care workers, whether it's doulas, whether it's hospice. The moment of death is the goal. Everything that we do before the death, in the months before death, leads up to that moment. And then following that moment, our support and guidance actually in hospice goes for a year. That's a whole nother topic. But the moment of death. And yet today, most people are alone at that moment with their family and their loved ones.
Mhm.
What in my heart, my goal is that the family have and experience that sacred moment of dying. That's a sacred, special moment. And they will carry that memory with them forever. And so, what occurs at that moment or hours before death is crucial. And that's why I see it as the goal of end of life workers. And that's not happening in a lot of cases.
No.
Now, I will say that end of life doulas are now working outside of the medical model.
Yes.
And their gift beside knowledge is time. Their goal is to be with the patient and family. If it's 3 hours or 4 hours, they're going to be there. And they're going to walk that family through waiting for the funeral home and what to do for the funeral. So end-of-life doulas are outside of this medical model, which is where hospice started.
Right.
But it's gradually become absorbed into the medical model and become more medically oriented than what the original purpose and focus was.
You know, Barbara, you've been doing this since the 80s, right? I mean, you were back when it was just starting. You came through the AIDS epidemic. You've gone through everything and you've seen it change. And now I wonder, after coming through this pandemic, I wonder if there is going to be that shift to the death doulas because of this. And because there's just not enough. There's not enough help. And being it like, we have doulas when we give birth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Unless hospice turns itself around,
Yeah.
doulas will, well, now I have to say, doulas have to be careful that they don't fall into the medical trap that hospice has.
Right.
The regulation trap. Those are pitfalls that end-of-life doulas need to be aware of and watch out for.
Yeah, because it all becomes it's billing.
That's a lot to do with it.
Oh my goodness. Well, and the sacredness of those moments, because they are sacred. How can caregivers try to prepare themselves for that? Or what can they do in the room or in the environment, whether they have hospice or not?
Okay. Number one, read my 3 books.
Absolutely.
You can have the dog or the cat on the bed. You have family all around. You don't have to have the shades drawn or the lights out. Create a comfortable environment in the hours before death. I recommend that each person there go in and have an alone time with the person that's dying. Now, they're going to be non-responsive, but even if a person is non-responsive, I believe they can hear really even in the moments following death. So each person talks, says what's in their heart, talk about the good times, talk about the challenging times. The person that's dying has been processing their life on many, many levels. Life is a billion-piece jigsaw puzzle, and you're adding pieces to that puzzle. So each person has alone time. And then put on their favorite music if they liked music. It doesn't have to be heart music. If you like Rod Stewart, put Rod Stewart on. Whatever music that is comforting. You don't have to have just candle lights. You might want a candle just for the aroma that it gives. Not that this area is going to smell, but that's kind of relaxing and subtle. And then kind of have a vigil. after everyone has had their alone time, then you can all sit there and tell stories and look at scrapbooks and reminisce. You can sit on the bed, lay on the bed, hold their hand, and that's your vigil. And you stay and you do that until the person is gone. Once they stop breathing, and remind me, and I'll talk about the scary part when they stop breathing. But once they stop breathing and you go, yeah, dad's gone, then before you call the funeral home, each individual person goes in again and says goodbye alone. You loved that body just like you loved dad inside of it, and you're going to miss it. So you go say goodbye, you talk in your heart, say whatever you feel led to say when everyone has done that. And that might be Aunt Bertha that you called and she drove across town. Right. You can wait and then call the funeral.
Okay. And you said to remind you when someone stops breathing.
Oh, okay. When someone stops breathing, because it isn't like in the movies where Judi Dench says something very profound and then closes her eyes and she's dead. It's not going to be like that.
No.
There are facial grimaces. There are moans and sounds, and their eyes are partially open. And there's this momentary grimace. It's almost that tug to get out of their body, but that's scary because it's not like Judi Dench. And so we think something bad has happened. No, that there's going to be that momentary disattachment, and that it may not be pretty. And oftentimes there's tears or a tear. Their eyes are partially open. So the body brings moisture. I don't think it's, oh, I'm so sad that I'm leaving. Right. They're concentrating on getting out of their body and nothing else. It's like the woman who's in labor pushing that baby to get out. She's not thinking of how her face looks when she's pushing or what the tear means. It's like, I got to get this over with. And this is how I do it. And I think we as watchers don't think about that at the time, which is why we need to know ahead of time it's going to happen.
Because, and immediately we think they're in pain, they're scared, they're upset, there's something, because that's what we need to hold on to, right? That's our part.
It's pathological. Something bad is happening. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And then, well, hospice didn't do it for us because they weren't here. If they had been here, it would have made a difference. And the thing is, they could have orchestrated everyone coming in and saying goodbye. They could have guided you and reassured you that nothing bad is happening.
And without that, you're left with this feeling. You're left with this bag of grossness that you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? And and it didn't go, quote, well. It wasn't the right thing. It didn't end the way we wanted it to end, or whatever is running through your head, and you're left with that and the visual. And that together is really hard.
It is. It's very hard. And that will add to our grieving, because now we think, oh, dad died wrongly.
Yes.
And oh my goodness. And we carry that along with just the and I hate to use the word just, but with the grief that we're carrying because this person is no longer here.
Yes. Yes. And I believe it affects our grieving process because we're stuck in those moments, and those moments become bigger and longer, and it bleeds into the grief because it's all part of it.
Absolutely. This is one of what I recommend when people are having the challenge of not understanding how mom died and that they think it was really bad, or I didn't get there, or she said whatever.
Mhm.
I recommend that they write mom a letter, put everything that they want to say and would have said if they had the opportunity down on paper. All the tears, all the fears, all the worry, all the words on paper. Then burn that letter and go outside and scatter those ashes to the wind. And let how well you live your life going forward be the gift of love that you give the person that's gone.
That's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Tend to think how sad and how much we cry says how much we miss this person. I want us to concentrate on how well we live our life going forward, be the gift of love and show how much we miss this person.
Oh gosh, that's beautiful. Because it doesn't help you, it doesn't help them, and to focus on one piece of their life and carry that with you instead of all of the other pieces of their life and all of the other pieces of their life with you.
Yeah.
It's shortchanging them, and it's shortchanging yourself.
Exactly. Something to think about, because grandma used to live at home and died at home. And that was our role model. But over the years, death has occurred elsewhere. And so we've lost the teaching, the understanding of what dying looks like. And we're coming full circle in that now grandma wants to die at home. And a lot of us are able to give that to her, but we need to have support, guidance, knowledge in order to make this the sacred experience that death is.
Well, I think I saw a statistic that said 67% of people want to die at home. But in order to do that and provide that, we have to be educated. We have to know what the heck we're doing and what to expect and and how to do it, because you just can't show up and be like, all right, well, we're going to do this today. You have to know.
Exactly. And yet, think of the number of people out there that are taking care of someone who's in the dying process, who are alone and who don't know and don't have the knowledge or the guidance, and the emotional guilt and the emotional stress that they will then carry with them forever, which really I want to lessen that, as you do. And that's why we do what we do.
Yes. And because we really don't have, there are no television shows or movies that show the real deal.
No.
And that show anything. And then even there just isn't. They try, and it has to fit in a little package in the right amount of time. And then everybody's happy.
I saw one of the Godfather movies. Don't know. I can't remember which one. Eli Wallace is in like a movie theater or sitting in some kind of, and he's breathing like a fish breathes.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, he has been at the bedside of someone dying. And that's the only, not that I see all the movies, but that's the only movie I've ever seen that I went, oh my gosh, this is how it really happened.
How about that? That was Godfather 3, for those of you wondering.
Oh, okay. And you remember the scene?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's true. You're right. And they just don't. And you keep waiting. Even on hospital shows, you keep waiting because you think, well, there's hospital advisors. They must They must have no, nope, still the same. Wake up. I love you all. Dead.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Well, I wonder if because really it isn't pretty.
Well, right. And I think so.
And that's probably why they don't want to show that it's not pretty.
Agreed. Any final words, any final thoughts or advice to a caregiver who's caring for their care partner and they can kind of see it on the horizon? Do you have any advice to give them for themselves, for their own feelings, for their person's feelings, anything?
As a caregiver, it's paramount, and we talked about this, that you have a support system, that you have a buddy, that someone you can verbalize and download and cry with. And, we tend to live either in the past or we live in the future. Very few of us live in the moment and really appreciate and get out of the moment what is there. And what I want people to do is that's where your energy and that is where you can focus. We should all do it every night before. The last thing I think when I go to sleep at night, I ask myself, what did I do today that made it worth trading a day of my life for? Did I find joy? Did I have peace of mind? What was today? Because really, that's all we have. So as a caregiver, we want our special person to be in the moment and let that, even if it's dementia, let that any given moment be gentle, be love-filled, be, I want to say purposeful, but that purposeful can be, did you see the squirrels at the feeder? That's really what's important in living, is any given moment. So let's give them that gift of trying to keep them in the moment.
A big thank you to Barbara Karnes for being my guest today. To find out more about Barbara and access all of her essential books and resources on end of life, visit her website, bkbooks.com. I hope you enjoyed our podcast today. Head over to daughterhood.org and click on the podcast section for show notes, including the full transcript and links to any resources and information from today's episode. You can find and review us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to your podcasts. We are also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Daughterhood the Podcast. Feel free to leave me a message and let me know what issues you may be facing and would like to hear more about. Or even if you just want to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. Also, a very special thank you to Susan Rowe for our theme music, the instrumental version of her beautiful song Mama's Eyes from her album Lessons in Love. I hope you found what you were looking for today: information, inspiration, or even just a little company. This is Roseanne Corcoran. I hope you'll join me next time in Daughterhood.